Welcome to Another Education is Possible, a podcast about education's radical potential. I'm your host, Jordan Corson. A couple of months ago, I was attending a workshop about teaching Palestine in Chicago public schools. And there's this really good conversation happening. It was a mix of activists and scholars and Chicago teachers. And there's this guy that I noticed in the background kind of participating, but also doing a lot of facilitating and organizing, prepping food, taking care of stuff. And this is a little bit awkward and probably problematic, but I noticed that his name was Dan Cohen. Of course, a Jewish name is the name of anybody who's Jewish, but, it was also a bit of a Jewy name. And so I mentioned the podcast and said, hey, I wanted to do an episode about Chicago teachers, and I'd be interested if you'd want to chat about participating. And he said, yeah, be interested. And we started corresponding. And then he introduced me to his wife, Julie, and what I thought would be just a conversation about what it means to be a public school teacher in this moment and teaching Palestine. And Dan also runs an after school club, became so much more. Dan and Julie are both dedicated activists, longtime organizers in the city of Chicago. They have decades of experience being engaged in the solidarity work of studying and struggling towards a free Palestine. And being in conversation with them was inspiring and offered something in this really dark time to connect and to think together and to hopefully be moved by each other. And I'm not really sure what else to say. I think we should just jump in and listen to Dan Cohen and Julie Kosowski. Just one quick note before the episode. There were some technical issues while recording, so our apologies that some audio is a bit staticky, but we hope that it doesn't disrupt from everything that Dan and Julie have to say. Now here's the episode. Dan Cohen, Julie Kosowski, welcome to Another Education is Possible. It is a spring day. We're recording just after Mother's Day. Yeah. And I think we've already done a bit of grounding, talking to each other about what it means to record in that moment. For our listeners who just heard your names and might not know who you are, how do the two of you know each other?
We're married. We met in 1993 on a blind date, and we're married in 2000. And our lives, we have two children. We live in Chicago. We have a 16-year-old and a 20-year-old, both daughters. And we really committed. I mean, since we met each other, anti-colonial, social justice, supporting and solidarity with Palestine has been part of our lives for the past over 30 years. How we operate daily, it's how we raise our children. It's our community, our closest friends. And I know in Julie's case, it's been a huge part of her family growth as well.
And you say you're married as if this is a newlywed thing, but it is seasoned marriage there. So before we bring the two of you together, maybe we could start back even before you met all those years ago as Jewish folks growing up. What did Zionism and Judaism look like for the two of you?
Woo! We come from I would say, very different backgrounds. Dan grew up in the Chicago suburbs. Our differences run the gamut of how we felt about Judaism and what our affiliation, our experience of Jewish life. So I grew up in a Jewish reform movement in the city. And I grew up with a father who was born in Germany and survived a genocide. He was born in Germany and grew up in Belgium as a hidden child. He and his parents escaped to Belgium after Kristallnacht. His parents eventually were deported and murdered in Auschwitz. And the short story is that um, he survived because the resistance was organized and was able to hide him. And apparently his parents had the resources, we know this from documents that we found, to provide some money to donate to the resistance in order to protect them. I mean, they had one coat that was, and a finite amount of money that they had. My grandfather was a tailor, and they were immigrants to Germany. They weren't German Jews. They didn't have property, a business, etc. He was a tailor, and I guess my grandmother was, and came from a long line of rabbis. And my grandmother, we don't know very much about at all, or her family, except that we know that she was, I wish there was another word, she was a housewife. She didn't get paid for her work. But I'm sure that they used every resource that they had, every bit of um, money that they had to give to the resistance to ensure their son's survival. They were initially in hiding together and then were separated because the resistance knew that it was easier to hide a child than a family of three.
Well, let's hear. So,
I should say it's a really painful moment. I can't believe that we stood out there now for, what is it, 19 months?
Yeah.
So I'm struggling with talking about myself too. That's very real.
It's very real.
And I don't, so much of me doesn't want to teach right now. So much of me just wants to demand and yell. And I appreciate so much that our journeys as anti-Zionists, as eventual anti-Zionists, is teachable. I mean, part of my story of becoming anti-Zionist is connecting the story of my father with the Palestinian story. As I learned about the Palestinian story as a story of ethnic cleansing, slow genocide, and oppression, and child imprisonment, and those things were made very real by growing up as the daughter of a hidden child survivor, a hunted hidden child survivor. The experience of Holocaust survivors, and so many Holocaust survivors around me were very economically successful and very successful people. And my father really struggled. I mean, he was very smart. He was a wonderful human being, and he was also suffering. Um, he underwent not just an instance of trauma, but over time and throughout his entire childhood, because he was born in 1933, the year that Hitler came to power, and in Germany, in Leipzig, Germany. And so his life experience was as an only child with two parents trying to figure shit out and how to, gauge their safety and the safety of their child and what to do. He wasn't really able to sit us down and say, here's my story. It was more a series of experiences that we witnessed as his children. One of which I remember, I was sitting in front of the TV and he was at the dining room table. We were in the same room, facing away from it. And so he couldn't see the screen. And we heard some crickets. There were some crickets, like it was a night scene. So you heard crickets and then like one car on the road swishing past. And he looked up and had this faraway look in his eyes. And he said, that's the sound I heard when we were escaping into Belgium from Germany. It was just another day. And he had, this real experience, this memory caused by the sound that he heard. And that was a little clue as to what he experienced because um, it wasn't clear to him either. Um, he didn't, it was hard for him to put together the years, et cetera. One of the themes I think of genocide and political oppression is chaos for children.
When much of early was much of her experience, and I would say if you had a healthy relationship with Judaism,
Yes. Yeah.
that's why you're surviving a survivor.
I mean, it's a lot of grief and a lot of pain going on and a lot of frustration and a lot of anger. And so to sort of come into it without being a practice speaker, having written a book or, and just launching into it.
Yeah.
And this is, I mean, I think part two of why my closest friends who are Palestinian, I think part of why they trust me is because I'm in touch with the pain that we need to feel in order to change things.
Hmm.
So I'm not
Yeah.
using, it's really, I find the filter that people sometimes hear my story through is not the filter I'm
Yeah.
growing up as the child of a Holocaust survivor wasn't a source of pride. And I didn't feel included in the commemorations, and we didn't attend commemorations. And then because of the age of 21, I was already feeling some disconnect, even younger than that, from mainstream Judaism as vis-a-vis how it exploited survivors and the Holocaust. I was already feeling that. I already saw how my dad's pain wasn't welcome because it wasn't pretty and it wasn't easy to contend with. And so it had to remain hiding and it had to remain hidden. The Israeli view of the new Jew, that Israel hates Holocaust survivors. That's why they say. And culturally, they're an embarrassment because they were like lambs to the slaughter. And this is in the literature. That's what I mean by the identity was exploited. It wasn't respected.
Mm-hmm.
And there's tons of claims that it was respected, and I would engage anyone in that conversation. But the truth, as I experienced it was in service of Zionism and the state of Israel. And if it didn't serve the state of Israel, it was to be ashamed of. And the impact of surviving a survivor and of the trauma my father went through, it doesn't have, or it has an impact. Trauma was real. That
Yeah.
there, things were broken.
Yeah.
And the healing wasn't through oppressing another group. The healing wasn't in a nation state because after Auschwitz, there was no state that I would trust, right? So having witnessed my father, the aftermath of his survival of state violence, the state was never the answer. Resistance was always the answer.
Mm. I think you're starting to tease out how you were brought up in a very complicated way, but with Zionism not necessarily being questioned. But before we get there, Dan, I'd love to hear how your own experiences mirror or deviate from that.
I grew up maybe 20 miles from each other, but incredibly different experiences. I grew up in a northern suburb outside of Chicago. My parents moved to the community in the early 60s. Once the sort of the highway extended further out, I was the youngest of I have three older sisters, and really grew up in what I would argue a nice suburb, safe suburb, white suburb, good schools. pretty much, I played Little League. I played every sport you can imagine. And went to a Hebrew school. But very much not, I was very much, I think, Jewish in some ways culturally. And we went to the high holidays, but it was never fully integrated into our religious, spiritual lives. I don't think Hebrew school was always a challenge to get to, and I fought it as a teenager and growing up. Bar mitzvah, again, it was kind of the thing we did. But at the same time, Zionism was, although we didn't call it Zionism, which is in the 70s and 80s, we didn't call it that. Israel was always right. And that was kind of the bottom line. And the Holocaust was awful and never again. And I experienced a pretty privileged, safe, comfortable experience. Culturally, I mean, some of my favorite memories looking back are preparing for the high holidays, cooking, chopping up the chopped liver with my mom, making fried matzahs with my dad. These are core memories I don't think about often, but my parents have passed over 20 years ago. So these are our core memories. And at the same time, I grew up in a community that was starting to become more Jewish, and I was a little embarrassed about being Jewish a little bit growing up. I mean, I had some Jewish jokes, and it was just not something that I leaned into or held up. I wasn't seeking friendships with Jewish kids in my schools. And yet, ironically, when I went to college, I joined a Jewish fraternity. And I don't know, part of that was just really not, I think for the most part, I was a nice kid, didn't do a lot of people thinking, kind of believed in the golden rule. And yet I felt outside of a lot of Jewish experiences as they were being presented to me. And it really wasn't until college and right after college I began to, and probably really through more of an anti-imperialist lens, like learning of, for example, the United States relationship with Puerto Rico as a colonial state, and really intimately experiencing that through a professor of mine, really challenged us to rethink all institutions, rethink our schooling, why we learn what we learn. And then rethinking what I know about the United States and Puerto Rico, gave me some lenses in which to examine the United States relationship with Israel, and began to question, there's a religious faith, there's a religion that I was taught growing up, and then there's this country with the military, and they seem so different. Even though, like I said, I was raised to believe that Israel was always going to be right. I was raised to believe that Arabs were terrorists, or at least at the very least bad. It was a simple binary of good and bad. And Israel was good and Arabs were bad. I don't even know if we called them Palestinians at that time growing up. It was just Arabs. I remember watching Nightline with Tech Koppel, maybe with my mom, or back, I don't know, it must have been 78, 79-ish, when during the Camp David Accords. Is that down? I just remember.
Even with the late 70s.
Yeah, I remember just seeing that on that on my mom. That was a big deal for my mom. And my mom was a wonderful woman, and I think for both my parents, it was very much Israel was going to be right, and it was the place we were going to be if when there's no Holocaust, kind of a classic stories, and it really began to ravel with me through a lens of anti-colonialism, and recognizing state power, recognizing the military, recognizing how countries operate, through hegemony and maintaining power that way. And then it just started making sense. Like, it was more a head thing, more than a physical body or emotional thing, which I think is very different. I wasn't living the experience that you were living in any way. It was very much like, almost like an academic, this makes sense. And then I'm applying the same lens to anti-racism. I'm applying it to what it means to be white, applying what it means to be a man, that I'm both benefiting from these privileges, and at the same time, I want to tear them down, right? So as a good social justice person, I'm trying to interrupt these systems, right? I'm out there trying to interrupt racism and sexism, but at the same time, I'm reminded that I'm also perpetuating them, right? So I'm in it and trying to break them up and benefiting from that. And once I began to really hold both of those complexities, that I'm both trying to interrupt them and tear the system down, but I'm also benefiting from them, and to hold the both and of that then it also became much easier then to see the complexities around being Jewish. And so those lenses really helped me come back to Judaism and come back to Zionism, question Zionism, and then to try to look at Judaism as a religion, as a faith that can provide spirituality and hope and connectedness.
It sounds like the two of you have both sides happening, but for you, Dan, it's a little bit that the move away from Zionism, or against Zionism, I should say, came from the outside in,
Right.
kind of learning and studying and thinking, oh shit, anti-imperialism is bad. And I'm making a connection that this is a form of imperialism.
Right.
And for you, Julie, it was the same recognition, but it was kind of bubbling up from inside and coming out as a feeling of, it's almost for you, Dan, the outside in, and for you, Julie, the inside out. I think there's also a way of seeing from experience and past and memory versus kind of formalized study. But it also, I would imagine, both are happening for both of you.
Well, one, I think my survival depended on figuring out what the fuck was going on with my family and why my father was suffering in rage or going through a deep depression, and that it seemed to be in contrast to so many of his qualities,
Mm.
his intelligence, his ability to connect with people, his energy. And then there was this complete shadow and also over him, and pain and anguish and deep depressions when he didn't function. And yet he had, you know, all the trappings of a good American life, right? You know, blonde, white, third generation. I mean, he had an education.
I also struggled with it.
Yeah.
I think that's important.
We did, yes, of course. He couldn't maintain employment. I mean, so my mom, neither one came from wealth, and it was paycheck to paycheck. And my father eventually, he he wasn't able to work consistently, and so financially we weren't well off. So there was a very distinct difference between our family's experience and those of the synagogue I went to and the camp I went to, and completely different than Dan's. I feel like I had these sort of experiences that were a bit more diverse. And all of that was also happening. And my parents were also radically kind and inclusive. And I saw examples of that over and over. And they both were. They very much had that in common. My dad, of course, over identified with everyone. One of the most lovely memories I have is when he came to an independent bookstore here in Chicago that we adore, because someone that a writer that I love so much and learned so much from, Noam Chomsky, an Egyptian physician and so much more, and writer. She was speaking and he came and he loved it and he loved her. In contrast to when I was living on a kibbutz the first year of the first Intifada, and which was also uh, a major contributor to unlearning the Zionist mythology, in part because it was a time when the new historian movement had several books published, and a couple have been translated into English. I was not disillusioned with Judaism. I was seeing it realistically. There was no romanticizing of Judaism. It wasn't possible. I understood Jews as being as, wonderful as any other group, or not wonderful as any other group. I didn't think it was special. I loved spirituality. I loved music. I loved singing. That was a part of the camp experience that I adored. I loved feeling like I could succeed and that I was supported. And I definitely felt that at the synagogue. And there were many contradictions within that feeling. There were many many things that contradicted that sense of safety. And one was that my dad's experience was a source of what, in part, a source of shame. And as I mentioned before, I felt like it was being exploited and not respected and not learned from. I knew that I wanted to live in Israel for a year. That was just a trajectory that was part of my entire childhood. My sister had done it a couple years prior. Um, I had to stay at home though and work full time in order to save enough money to afford it. Um, and so I was an older student when I went. I was 21 already. We had 17-year-olds in the program. And I think that my life experience and um, being somewhat older helped me to see things differently. I knew how to live away from home on my own. Um, I wasn't trying all those things for the first time. And so, and it was, the Intifada began in December of 87. And I was there for 10 or 11 months between 1988 and 1989.
I would imagine the combination of the first Intifada and encountering the new historians as they're emerging is a recipe to fight for Palestinian liberation.
Yes, because I saw again the commonality of political violence. It didn't matter what state it was happening in.
Yeah.
So what resonated was the truth as I was exposed to it, which refuted all the Zionist mythology that I had grown up with.
Yeah.
And the contradiction of also, as we were learning in our Hebrew literature classes and history classes, of this concept of what Zionism meant for Israelis, that it was, you know, we're not going to be in a ghetto studying. We're going to be out in the sun and getting dirt under our nails and draining the malarial swamps.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure to anyone listening resonates in terms of Zionist mythology. And that to me was not an extension of learning what is necessary for safety for everyone. That was what I eventually understood to be colonization and supremacy, European supremacy. So the contradiction there of the internalized, of course, internalized European supremacy and the idea that the survival of, the idea that the survival of Jews was based on the disappearance of the indigenous population of Palestine. I don't need to spell out these predictions, but I needed to see it and I needed to believe it. And I've oftentimes said, I believe Auschwitz, so I believe Palestine, I believe Gaza. And I'd love to break that down some more, even for myself, but it resonates so hard.
Really about learning that like Jews were good people and bad. I mean, they weren't this special chosen people. You've shared a story before where you just won this, you just got nominated to be the president of SIFTI or something, and you came home because I think it's such an important.
This was a seed planted. It was very disruptive. So when I was 17, a senior in high school, I became president of the Reform Movement, Chicago area Jewish youth organization. And I came home. It was a weekend-long event that we were at. So I came home, and my dad was sitting at the kitchen table, and I sat with him, and I told him that I had won this election and that I was president of this Jewish youth organization. And he got tears in his eyes, and he said, I wish my parents were here to see this. And of course, that's poignant and touched me. And then he stopped and his whole facial expression changed. And he pointed at me and he said with a whole lot of intensity and anger, "Never forget, it was a Jew that turned my parents in." This was part of the story we were learning over decades that was coming out in bits and pieces. There was actually a Jewish man named Jacques in Belgium who was trying to save his own ass by turning in the hiding places other Jews. Um, my understanding is he didn't survive. We didn't know that for a long time after, but I also know the resistance tried to assassinate him. I don't know what else to call it, a gift. I don't even think he understood what he was giving me, but he was providing very authentically a truth um, that we cannot trust one another because we present similarly, because we share an aspect of our identity. We trust one another based on our values and our actions. And I'm not safer among Jews. And that's, I think, really what sunk in. Our safety comes from shared struggle and shared resistance and understanding and believing the threat of political violence and oppression. And as long as there's humanity, there's going to be systems of oppression that need to be resisted and exposed.
You're importantly pointing on that flip side of the coin, right? As long as there are forces of oppression, there will be forces of resistance. And as long as there are people turning against people, there will be people with shared values struggling together.
Which does not mean that there's a natural, I don't think it's natural for oppression to exist or systems of oppression to exist. In other words, it's not inevitable. But it is crushing. So systems of oppression do threaten people's ability to understand when you're in survival, whether you're doing it because you don't have enough money to pay for healthcare in Chicago, or you're in an extreme situation of genocide in Gaza. It's recognizing the connection between those things where liberation is possible.
Yeah.
I think this is why, we so often hear people talking about, although I hate it because it suggests that we sacrifice Palestinians for our liberation. We do not believe that Palestinians should be sacrificed and we could all be liberated. But we are being shown who we are in that violence.
I was going to jump in and something you said, Julie, because when Jordan was talking about the outside in, the inside out, and how that story of your father, how it solidified the sense of shared struggle, about shared values. Early in our relationship, we would show up in spaces, show up in Palestinian spaces or Solidarity with Palestinian spaces. And I was always struck, like Julie has like really beautiful, trusting relationships with many of the Palestinian people in the spaces. And at first I didn't get it, I didn't really see it. But for me, I was showing up trying to sort of hide my Judaism to some degree. I don't want to identify with the oppressing, right? So here I am, this white kid from the suburbs, while they do the right thing and fight against and fight for and with Palestinians and against Zionism. And so I wouldn't even want to identify my last name. I knew my last name would trigger them thinking that I'm Jewish, and therefore they're going to think I'm that kind of Jew. And I relate this a little bit to how like white folks not wanting to identify with Trump, right? Like I don't want to be that kind of white person, right? And so I showed up in these spaces in an inauthentic way. Showed up, only part of myself was showing up. And I wasn't building strong, authentic relationships built in solidarity and love and connection. And Julie was showing up fully as a Jewish person, fully as someone who shared her full identity was in spaces. I almost compared it to like you and the people we know who that you showed up as a full circle and I showed up as a half circle. Right. And in that full circle, like you were embraced by the community. Where I was in it, I was showing up, but I was not part of it because of that. I had to show up fully as myself. I had to do my own work around that. But I think that was always something that struck me as we were early in our relationship, building a community.
I think you're both touching on the early stages of you becoming anti-Zionist and joining the Palestine Solidarity Movement. And this is also, it sounds like, when the two of you meet and come together. So I'd love to hear a bit more about how this budding relationship, which became a partnership, a family, how that influenced your work as anti-Zionist, your thinking as anti-Zionist.
Rad's core was showing up. I feel like a big part early in our relationship, both as we're going to know each other and build a relationship, was showing up in front of people struggling.
Yeah.
And that's something that I've always learned from Julie. I had to break out of some of my own discomfort around that, but it meant showing up, and whether that was Palestinian struggle, Puerto Rican struggle, and then really falling in love over our shared values. I think in many ways, that was, you know, I mean, we laugh about it now, but like some of our earliest dates were like there was something like chemical, like we would, you know, want to be watching early in our relationship, watching Noam Chomsky films together. I mean, it sounds funny, but these were like intellectual, emotional, like embodied like experiences, and they still are. Right now, now the pain of the genocide, and it's so full. But early on, like these were like beautiful, inspiring, motivating, connecting experiences, showing up, you know, the struggles, but also the intellectual connections, but then building community too. And I remember early in our dating, we were at someone else's wedding, and an elder in the Palestinian community who's still alive, like shared said, hey, you know, we're gonna be going to each other's family events for the next 30 years. You know, we're gonna go to our birth, death, weddings, and we still are, right? And it's one of the most profound. Like, I don't think I got it 30 years ago, and yet it's played out for 30 years, right? And now we're getting to be the age that she was, right? And she's still living, and we've experienced all of that and more. You know, in the tragedy of the current genocide, and but to me, it was deeply rooted community experiences that were also very much about figuring out our own values and our shared values that then brought us together in relationship. It was what our wedding was about. It was what, at the core, of raising our children and staying in the city of Chicago and being part of local union movements here and local communities that we're part of. It's been all of
that. I love that. And I think, you know, on the lighthearted end of it, it's a couple after my own heart. Hey, babe, what should we do tonight? How about we go watch 5 Broken Cameras?
Right.
Manufacturing consent was the big one for us.
I
I would definitely add Ekbal Ahmed. I mean, I got to tell you, reading Layla Khaled's autobiography was intense. And yeah, that idea too, I don't know why it just struck me, but that idea of violence and nonviolence, and how that played a role. I've never felt compelled to reject violence as a part of liberation. And I've never really said that out loud either, but it gets back to that story I told of Jacques and how the resistance was trying to assassinate him because of the number of people that he was turning into the Gestapo, despite their shared identity as Jews. he was turning these people in to save his own ass. And although none of us knows how we would behave in such a dire situation, I think it's really important to be reflective about it. And that idea, I think, also was planted in me. Resistance isn't pretty, and it's still resistance. That taps into so much of what we're learning now about international law and the collapse of order and the collapse of institutions, except for, the individuals. But I keep coming back to me is the idea of collapse and genocide, and what has to collapse in order for that to happen, or did the collapse already happen, which I do believe, and we didn't notice until we didn't notice as well as we should have noticed. Right? Slow genocide is still genocide.
For me, like learning about international law through the lens of Puerto Rico, like colonized people have the right to use violence according to international law, and seeing that play out with a professor like it was set up and framed by the FBI in the late 90s, and served 4 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit, and learning about international law through that lens. I think we both understood that resistance is resistance, and also the respect of like how Palestinians decide the resistance is about them. It was never about like we weren't ever. I mean, I think that's part of our. I don't know where that came from for both of us,
Right?
but that level of humility and like understanding and I mean, that was never. I don't think we ever even had this conversation. It just was. Freedom.
I tell a story. I had this amazing doctor growing up. His name was Edwin B. Miller, and he was a source of strength for me, and he really believed in me. And he had his own, of course, he was significantly older than me. He had his own story of tragic pain. His father died by suicide in front of him while he was in medical school. And he became Buddhist. He was Caucasian, he was a white guy, but he became Buddhist as an adult. And he would give me all these lessons. Whenever I had a doctor's appointment with him. And one of them, he said, if someone steps on your foot and it hurts, he said, first of all, you have to acknowledge that it hurts. Say ouch, and say ouch out loud. When something hurts, we have to communicate it, right? We're always in relationship in our humanity. And he said, and if they don't get off your foot, consider the fact that maybe they didn't realize they're standing on your foot and didn't hear it. So then get their attention and say, excuse me, you're stepping on my foot. It hurts. Please get off my foot. If they still don't get off your foot, he said, shun them and tell them to get the heck off your foot. That made a huge impression on me.
I can't help but think that's a little bit different than all right, you have a 15-minute appointment and they're going to be fun.
Right?
But doctors giving you anti-colonial life lessons.
Right.
Not to denigrate doctors. There are plenty of, doctors in the struggle, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But he was defying the system, wasn't he?
Yeah.
By doing exactly what you just pointed out so succinctly.
Getting back to a bit of your relationship, it sounds like there was a lot of unspoken, I never know how to put it because it's not invisible. It's just more felt. But if you're both reading Leila Khaled and then not discussing it, but just assuming that resistance is necessary and not yours to dictate, there's something taught and learned that maybe isn't a direct lesson. But I also wonder, not what's not shared, but just how you both took your own paths. So this doesn't have to be pinned into the two things that I came to know you about, but I know eventually for you, Julie, that's been work with JVP and work with a very, very well-known synagogue, Tzedek Chicago. And for you, Dan, that's happening. Actually, I can't believe I'm saying this. A little bit of behind the scenes. We recorded an episode with an amazing teacher, but unsurprisingly, due to, how to put it, Zionist bullshit and suppression, we might not be able to air it because of legal reasons. but you're really the first in-service current teacher that we're having on the podcast. So I think there are probably many places that you've taken this, but the two that I'm most aware of are for you, Dan, and this both after school program that I've heard about. I'd love to hear. We came to know each other through a Teaching Palestine Chicago Teachers Workshop and just your everyday life as a classroom teacher. And then for you, Julie, in organizing spaces such as JVP and then getting, building SEDEC Chicago or contributing and supporting SEDEC Chicago.
I wouldn't say I've contributed or supported those places more than Dan, right? There is he might disagree, but there's but 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 I haven't. I'm not on the board. I'm not. But they're important to us, and we're present when we're there, and we're certainly supportive of the building of them. But the role that we play, we're very much a partnership, very very much partnership. So I don't think he feels there isn't my lane and his lane. There's our lane with different strengths, and we complement one another.
From you, I mean, you step into uncomfortable situation with courage and conviction, moving in a liberatory, loving, healing way. And I watched you do that, whether it's on the street corner, whether it's with my students. And that's the part that has given me more and more courage, even in the classroom. Like I've been teaching 33 years. Next year I'm going to retire after next year. Hard to believe.
Wow. Congrats.
A few more weeks this year. And, but I think, for me, education was always about what are we doing in this space that's going to make the world, to make our communities more just. Right. So I remember early in my career being a substitute teacher in a big public high school in Chicago. I had a break, and I sat down to read a newspaper in the library when they still had newspapers, and the front page of the Tribune at the time said something like 200,000 children are living in poverty. And here I'm a brand new teacher. I just sat back and go, damn, like if what I'm doing in this classroom isn't about changing that, then what am I doing? Right. So it was always deeply rooted in my core about working toward a more just school, a just society, and helping my students ask enough questions in an environment that's safe enough where they can grow and take those risks. What's happened specifically over the last 19 months, I say 20 months because in September of 2023, we officially started a Middle East North African student club at our high school. And I say we at that time was me and my co-sponsor, who's a Palestinian woman teacher at our school. And we barely knew each other at the time. Students came to us in that spring wanting to start a club because and this is where Julie comes in clearly, was that a Palestinian student at a big public high school. I teach a high school with 3,600 people in a very small area of the Palestinian population, probably less than a dozen or 2 dozen. And but a student was talking to someone in the community. She's Palestinian, and the woman in the community is a white Jewish woman who knew Julie really well, right? And so because of these long-standing relationships over 5, 10, 20, 25 years of showing up, she said, at the school, there's this guy you need to connect with. Right? She gave him my name, right? And because she knew Julie. And then suddenly, and because of that, she came to me, and I immediately said, I'm honored, and there's a Palestinian teacher here you need to connect with. And then the club began. And then after 2 weeks of meetings, so October 7th, right? We barely knew our students. They barely knew each other. I barely knew Wafaa. I barely knew my co-teacher and my co-sponsor. And suddenly our club became a space where kids needed to be. They needed a place. And actually our school initially did a really nice job of providing. I think October 7th was Saturday. October 9th, we had a day off for Indigenous Peoples Day. And we came back on Tuesday. And the school actually reached out to us and asked if the students in our club, if they need a space to be together. And that came out of nowhere. someone at our school did the right thing, and they were getting under a lot of pressure by Zionists about about the Jewish students in the building and what's going to happen to them when they go back. And someone said, well, what about other students? What about other kids? And at that time, I remember both my co-sponsor and I, we wept, thinking that an institution actually would center Palestinian students enough to provide them a space, just a space where they could gather more and have a counselor there if they needed to. I never experienced that in 32 years, that someone actually would center Palestinian students in that way.
And what do you think? And what preceded that to make that possible? This is where all the movement links.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think something that helped them. I mean, our school, their teachers were leading anti-racism work in the school for a decade, right? And so there are some systems in place and some language in place around privilege, around systems of oppression, around how you show up for the people that gave people, I think, empower the tools to ask the right question. Who else is being impacted here? What's that counter narrative, right? Bringing in like critical race theory, like what are the other narratives here that are at play? Again, if it's just Jewish students, what does race have to do with that, right? So these were white students, white families who were demanding that their kids be taken care of wonderfully, and what other stories and voices are part of that. So that, I think, enabled our administration to do what they did. But from that point on, our club became a space for holding each other, for just being present. And then we began to, because at that point, as soon as we started to organize a little bit as a club and had advertised for a meeting, again, Zionists in very, very critical of our images, putting a Palestinian flag. And so we were very much under some heat early in October, November from the local community, and our administration took some bad steps as well. And we stumbled, and we were hurt, and we were hurting, and I realized really quickly that, and I learned this from Julie and others, that our students' existence is a problem. Just who they are by showing up as Palestinian, by saying I'm Palestinian, by saying I have family in Gaza, and we have kids who have family in Gaza. We're waking up each day wondering if their houses were up or not, and their houses were destroyed. They were just there in the previous summer. I have students that were there in 22. And so as we moved into the fall and winter, we began to organize. And we had a guest speaker, two guest speakers that came to the school. We ended up having a Palestinian cultural festival in January with an outside community. Again, this is the outside relationships where Julie played such a key role in both. I mean, my co-sponsor and I are in the building dealing with trying to hold and love our young people, and we're coming home exhausted. And then thank goodness Julie's able to hold some of that and ask us the right questions and get us back in the ring, almost like give us what we needed to get back in the ring the next day. And at the same time, what was also happening was our student families met. So different Palestinian families, Arab families, they met. They didn't know each other. And so suddenly at our events, they're building connections and community. And now they're starting to organize.
And there were layers and decades of community building prior to this that served this moment.
We're fortunate. Again, I'm a veteran teacher. I'm white. I'm male. I'm Jewish. I'm a former administrator. My job is secure, right? So, and my co-sponsor at that time was a non-tenured Palestinian teacher. So we were an incredible mix of both. And everything we did was very strategic. And we had this incredible cultural festival at the public library, the biggest event they ever had. Hundreds of people came. Again, everything we did, there was pushback, and there was pushback, and there was pushback, and we just kept
layers of organizing.
Yeah.
Concentric circles of organizing that was strengthening as they met each challenge. And there were challenges. There were, people speaking up at the board meetings.
We got inspired, a local newspaper, 2-page expose, naming our names. And it continued, right? I mean, it culminated last summer with a 21-page complaint written by a community member against us. That's on the Illinois Attorney General's desk right now, right? And with ISB making demands of the school to protect their Jewish students. Meanwhile, we're I'm being verbally harassed in public by parents
And private, the bathroom.
and private. Yeah, different things are happening. And so and we're talking about again this question of safety, right? We don't need to echo that, but it played out. All those things played out, and we just kept moving. We had an iftar at the school in the spring, right? And local community was invited, and their friends came, and other people came, and then we had the first ever Arab American Cultural Festival in the month of April last year. Right, culminated with a beautiful festival at the school during lunch period. And there's
Jessica in the hallway.
yeah, not cutting and being played. And incredible story was there was a young man who just came back to the United States. I think he was spent some time there, was raised in Palestine and in Jordan, and came back. And his first week back, we're having this festival. He shows up, and the women are wearing thobes. There's Debka dancing, and he just arrived from Jordan, and he's sampling at the school. As Julie said, like it's all downhill from here, right? But it was beautiful, and we continued to have these beautiful, deep, painful yet healing experiences that kept us going. Our kids kept us going, and we just wanted to be there for them. And now, literally, we're 12 months later. We had a vigil in the spring for Gaza. We had an incredible panel of speakers in December. And it continued. And this past April, we just got back. We spent a weekend. Took our kids, Julie, myself, our co-sponsor. We went to Dearborn, Michigan. We drove 4 hours on a bus, went to the Arab American Museum there with 23 young people. Like 90% of the club came. And I'm getting emotional. It's what everyone needed. We needed to be together. We always needed to be together. And then to be in Arab spaces where we walked into the Arab grocery store and to see our kids just start smelling, right? And they're smelling home, right? And they're tasting home. And then we went to an Arab store, right? Where everything from Muslim prayer rugs to thobes to blenders to luggage everything's in there, right? And our kids are trying on clothes, and it was an incredibly grounding, healing, affirming amidst genocide. And we're holding each other, and it doesn't take much, right, to just be like, oh, right, there's a genocide, right, and our families, and so that's a little bit of the past 18 months that is in many ways the most meaningful work I've been a part of. And it's really just about holding space for young people in a compassionate, critical, loving, liberatory way.
All right, I need to jump in and say this is going to be very rambling, and I think it needs to be couched, as the two of you said, in the idea of just there's nothing but horror in the last 18 months.
Yes.
And yet, I think what the two of you just shared is this is not a podcast about. It's not a podcast that aims to educate about this topic, right? I hope that people maybe hear the new historians, and a few listeners may suddenly be reading Ilan Pape or something, but I'm not going to sit here and explicate and tell you what it is. But I hope that it helps people see education differently and understand the complex role that education plays in the world. And what you both just shared gets at, I can't think of something that wasn't touched on in that. You mentioned that school plays a really important role, that there's community building and there's care and there's knowledge, but that very much education is something that doesn't have borders. And this club was only possible because of Julie's organizing, because of community that was already in place. And it's something that spills out and also builds community. It moves out into outside of school spaces. And then in those spaces, it comes together. And that's amazing to think that families met and bonded and built something together through this after school club. And it's physically not held to a space. You're literally traveling across state lines and experiencing museum and food and dance.
And taking it even more, the leadership of the youth, they became intersectional. So the Spirit Club, the Latina Club joined So Day of the Dead had Gaza,
Mm.
you know, photos that they had joined together for the vigil for Gaza in the city of where they are, and the shared understanding between the group and the ages, the age mixing. There was an event at the end of last year at one of the graduating seniors' homes, and we were all outside. There were cicadas everywhere, and we were sitting around. There were seats. There was food, of course. We're talking. Everyone's kind of broken up into different groups. It's mixed ages. It's community. It's parents. It's students. It's teachers. And slowly, everyone was in a huge circle in a chair, and it was cross talk all together, cross generational, but everyone. And we heard amazing stories. And the students again led. The students led. They led with their stories. So one of the students who was in Gaza with his family in the summer of 22 told a story about his skateboard and the importance of connecting with youth in Gaza because he brought his skateboard. Of course, his parents wanted to study and not worry about genocide, right? And focus on just doing well. That's why we're in this country to get there's just so many stories wrapped up in it. And he told this story. Right? So he lived as a storyteller. He lived as a historian. He lived as a writer in sharing this with everyone.
And also, it was beautiful, and the multi-generation stories of elders who were in Palestine and the youth. And I have to say this, and just because I just have to. I mean, the part of this organizing, the cost to me and to my co-sponsor myself, obviously is very different. And I know you know this, but again, for her to show up as Palestinian and take the risk she took as a non-tenured teacher, mine pales to that, right? I mean, my risk is very minimal, right? And we were able to both strategize around that, but at the same time, her courage is extraordinary and so inspirational for our young students, for our young Palestinians, for our young Muslim students, to see her in a space where, again, she's like, Dan, no one, I was taught never to do this. I was taught to just put my head down and study. But I can't do that. I can't do that as a teacher. I can't do that for these young people, right? And so they see in her such courage and grace and humor and compassion. I have to name that because I don't, it's not about me, right? It was always about us. It was always about the kids.
And the relationship.
Yeah.
And the strength.
Because we're family now. Her family's our family. Our family's her family.
And support services. She was at our house for Passover. Yeah. When my father died, the number of people who were in our home for Shiva, who grew up Palestinian and remained steadfast.
And they stayed with it. I mean, yeah. And again, that a genocide survivor died in another genocide. And we sat there holding all of that at his funeral. Is important.
I really tried in this podcast to cover a wide range of Jews. And strangely, one of the most difficult thing, I think, out of the 20-ish episodes that we've recorded, we only have a couple of folks who didn't follow the trajectory of either non-Zionist or fully Zionist, unlearning that and becoming anti-Zionist. And I'd love to, that's a big question to close on, but what is it like to raise anti-Zionists, to have kids raised Jewishly who will never be beholden to settler colonial ideologies, to Jewish supremacy?
I don't know. Such a complicated question, but I do. It's a beautiful question. Thank you for asking it, and thank you for helping us consider that.
Right.
I mean, I have to tell you that I have a very close friend who took my younger daughter practice driving last week. When she was a teenager, she's Palestinian, growing up in a small town in the Midwest. It was during the Iraq War. And one day she was out sick and she found out that the FBI had come to the school because someone had said that she threatened the life of the president, something like that. She's reflected with us. She's a very close friend. She's reflected with us about what, every time we share what's going on with the MENA Club, she reflects on what that might have been like to be affirmed in high school. That's deeply, deeply moving. And we also feel like we're blessed to have my beautiful sister who is also anti-Zionist. And we've got, the family by choice co-raising our children as aunties. That's very real. It's very important.
I think about part of anti-Zionist and parents is our deep values, anti-racism, right, against sexism, against colonialism. That shows up all kinds of ways. Right, it's early on. It's thinking, just our children were just part of our lives, right? So going to demonstrations, back, 20 years ago. So against the war, and I remember, carrying little, our oldest at that time on my shoulders. Right, so just showing up, but again, integrating our young children into our lives completely, and then at some point when we're moving in, more publicly anti-Zionist and having a community around that, our rabbi's there. Our rabbi's showing up in all our events, right? So our children, we're out there in the streets, whether it's against Rahm Emanuel and the cover up of the killing of Laquan McDonald in Chicago and shutting down Michigan Avenue. And who's there? But both her first grade teachers there at her public school, part of the CTU organizing, right? Because we organized the teachers union, the Chicago Teachers Union, and a rabbi there, right? And so
What's that?
the people who love them the most, her first grade teacher, right, who loves her, right, and her rabbi's there, right? And so and then we're at the hunger strike for the closing of Diana High School, right? And again, the rabbis there, the first grade teachers there, again, so the most immediate people in their lives who love them. But outside of family, right? And our first graders' lives, right? That represent institutions, exactly.
Yeah.
They're showing up, right? So the values are surrounding them, and then obviously, our kids were a little older when our congregation started, and so they didn't get necessarily the benefits of a youth program there, which was hard and lonely. I know Julie took that, and that's a real challenge there. Like Julie, I think, really battled being part of a community, a Jewish community, and struggled to find one.
We didn't have one.
Right, we didn't have one, and so we were very much those first 8-9 years part of other.
And since then, it's still in formation and being built.
Right.
We didn't have other Jewish anti-Zionist families to raise our children with.
Right. Which was hard.
Until they were much older.
Right.
And then all of their kids are much younger.
Right.
So that was hard.
It still is. Yet, and our children now are navigating as Jews, as anti-Zionist Jews, what it means to stand up in solidarity with Palestinians. Some of them are their friends that they've grown up with. The same way that our kids showed up in the struggle when schools were closing, predominantly Black and brown schools in the city of Chicago. What does it mean for a 12, 13, 14-year-old white kid to show up in those spaces, right? And navigate that and listen and be a listener and showing up in support. And how can you be support? Recognizing that my school's staying open, but yours is closing. Right, so recognizing those systems.
It's exposure, and it's normalizing the exposure, right? It is a natural extension of our values, and so it's things we can directly teach and things they have to learn on their own. I mean, I've never asked them if they consider themselves anti-Zionist directly. I hope that, it's not hope or more deliberate than that, but they have to find their own paths as well. So just like I learned my parents' values from what they did,
yeah,
we hope that that's happening here too, however imperfectly, and uh,
Yes.
and we stumble and we're walking contradictions. All of us are.
Today's episode was produced by Yardane Amran, Samantha Haley, and me. Music by Yardane. If you like our episodes, please like us, follow us, subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen. You can also find us on Instagram at Another Ed is Possible. We'll be sharing links to some mutual aid campaigns, ways to support projects, particularly those that Dan and Julie have identified this week. Thanks as always for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode of Another Education is Possible.